Today on the Core of Everything, we have the pleasure of talking with the Pulitzer Prize winner, Elizabeth Kolbert. Elizabeth is an American journalist and a staff writer at The New Yorker. She was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in 2015 for her book, The Sixth Extinction. Her book, Under a White Sky, was one of the Washington Post's 10 books of 2021. And her new book, H is for Hope, is out now, where she investigates climate change from A to Z, or A to Z if you're American. In Under a White Sky, the general theme is that in fixing one problem in our battle against global warming, we seem to be causing many more. In the words of Elizabeth Kolbert, this book is about people trying to solve problems created by people trying to solve problems. Or, as the Danish saying puts it, pissing in your pants will only keep you warm for so long. Ladies and gentlemen, enjoy the episode. I really appreciate you coming on, Elizabeth. Thanks so much. I read Under a White Sky in a weekend. It was fantastic, I have to say.
Oh, thank you.
That's right. And it seems the book is really about in trying to solve climate change or global warming, we're causing more problems than we are solutions. Is that fair? Is that a fair assessment?
Well, it's sort of the idea is to trace this sort of habit that we have of, you know, intervening sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously in natural systems. And then when we realize that those interventions have caused problems, we try to intervene again. We have a very hard time, rethinking things from the ground up because, um, and the stories in the book, you know, some they have different there are different reasons for that. In some cases it's impossible to go back. You simply can't go back. The system has been permanently altered. In some cases it's politically too difficult to go back. So there are different reasons for that, but it creates this pattern that I think we see just played over and over again.
Yeah, of course. And I just wanted to say, put you up there on the sort of the stories because at the talk at Columbia University a few days ago, you said that you weren't a scientist, but that your role is to tell stories. And your book has, Under a White Sky, a mix of science, witty anecdotes, references to, I think, Mark Twain in the first page and T.S. Eliot later on. Was that sort of done with intention to make it more easily accessible to everyone? And how important do you think telling stories is in spreading awareness about sort of climate change and global warming?
Well, I think it's, super important, but of course I sort of come to it with that prejudice, if you were, or bias as a journalist. You know, all of this, li huge libraries, massive libraries of information on scientific and environmental issues, they're just not accessible to most people. And they have to be in order, and these are problems that have to be tackled on a massive, global level, obviously. And so you need, the role that journalists play, as I see it, is to get that and try to translate that information in a way to into language that a lay audience can understand, and that you know I think an important part of that project is telling stories that people are interested in. These are often very difficult issues. They're kind of painful issues. People are not exactly inclined to read about them all the time. So I think that it's important to tell stories that are interesting to people in a way that will get them to try to get them, you in hopes it will get them to pay attention. How's
Yes, exactly. And
that?
yeah, of course. And I mean, obviously, the climate situation is distressing. There's no doubt about that. But there's a line between, if you're combining science with storytelling, there's a line between sort of scientific objectivity and sort of intentionally tugging at the heartstrings of an audience without coming across as preachy. So, when you write, is it to primarily inspire action or is it to sort of disseminate knowledge?
It is definitely the latter, the knowledge dissemination. I think that journalists, are not in a position to know what's going to inspire action. We tend to, and I'm a real old style journalist. I believe in, putting the information out there. I guess I still believe that even in a climate or, an atmosphere where information and where misinformation seems to be just as prevalent as real information and, fighting for its life, as it were. But I don't think we're very well positioned to know what's going to inspire action. Um, so I don't think that, there's a lot of talk and there's a lot of debate, both in climate circles and in, journalistic circles about what our role is. But I guess I've taken a very, you could argue, naive view that our role is to get the information out there in a way that people will actually be able to access it. And increasingly you're fighting for people's attention. So
Yeah.
you not only have to, they not only have to be able to access, they have to actually, they have to want to access it in some way. So those are big burdens. That's not that's not
Yeah.
easy. And then to say, well, I'm only going to do things that, I think inspire action. Well, as I say, I don't know how we would know that.
For sure. I guess there's a risk of scaremongering, but I guess that's also a good thing to do in a way because it does make people um, it might inspire action more likely than just being objectively scientific and here are the facts and you can make up your own mind for them. Um,
Well, you know, I don't think I believe in scaremongering. I hope I
yeah,
don't
no,
practice it. I mean, honestly, the facts, as the faculty, in the climate school at Columbia will tell you, are so terrifying,
Mm,
that you don't have to scaremonger. You simply have to present them, but you do have to present them in a language that isn't, the probability of, plus or minus, uh, 0.7 degrees or whatever, which really doesn't mean much to anybody.
yes, of course. Um, we can get onto that a little bit later, but one thing I listened to your podcast episode on multiversal milkshake, I think, which was
Okay.
really interesting. And one thing you said in there was you were a leave it alone environmentalist. So what does that mean?
Well, I think there's a lot to be said for, I'm not a, I don't have, and I think that comes through in Under a White Sky. I'm not a techno optimist. That's a very, sort of fashionable thing. Well, technology, may have gotten us into this mess, but it will also get us out of this mess. It's gotten us out of all these messes in the past. I don't think that the past is a particularly good guide to the future. um, and I uh, don't have faith that some magic techno bullet is going to save us from what is a very, um, a system, changes that have a tremendous amount of inertia. We're not talking about things that can be easily reversed by, any stretch of the imagination. So I think that the more we can do, for example, to, leave ecosystems intact, they will be, um, still greatly modified and changed and damaged by climate change. But the more just, then this is not an original idea. This is, E.O. Wilson's Half Earth. The more places that we can leave more or less to their own devices, the more species we can leave more or less to their own devices, the more chance we have that those ecosystems will be able, at least some of their participants will be able to adapt, will be able to migrate and survive.
Hmm. Yes, one of the themes of the book is sort of this line between unnatural methods and natural methods, as it were. So one of the unnatural methods is sort of using CRISPR or gene editing. Uh, is it
Yeah, we
right that?
just yeah,
Sorry.
we just saw that this, that there's just this big headline about, woolly mice, mice with mammoth genes, um, is that going to save, bringing back the mammoth, which I think everyone would agree is a task that we're not yet up to. But let's say we were up to it.
Hmm.
um, how does that help us? Well, we are still pursuing the same activities that are driving so many species that we haven't even identified yet, to the brink or over the brink, to focus our attention on these genetic manipulations, which, maybe are useful in some cases. I don't want to say they aren't. Um, they're very, time consuming, resource uh, heavy activities. And they seem to present some hopeful story, but when you think about it, one species or two species or 10 species or 20 species out of, we don't know how many, 10 million, let's say, that's not going to do it.
No, it feels rather reactive than proactive to go back and bring woolly mammoths back onto Earth. It's very reactive. But there are some bits of optimism behind that, and one of the things you referenced was the American chestnut tree, which I thought was quite a sweet little part of the book. Um,
Yeah, and that's actually a really interesting story. And I was completely, I do want to say, so I was, while I'm not a techno optimist, I'm also not a technophobe. And I was very eager, I was very looking forward to planting one of those trees in my backyard. I live in a part of the world that was chestnut habitat, prime chestnut habitat. Um, but I will say two things to that story. One very sad thing, which is that the guy who developed the tree, Bill Powell, whom I spoke to for the book, died relatively young, about a year or so ago. That was very sad. And another thing is that that has gotten completely messed up, the uh, approval process for that, because of the a lot of the trees that they had genetically engineered did not have the exact um, change that they had said they had. How's that? They were not developed using CRISPR. They were developed in a different method that predated CRISPR. And so that became, they've basically had to, I believe, pull back even
okay.
attempt to license those trees.
Okay. And these are trees that are resistant to the fungi that was wiping them out in the first
Yes,
place.
exactly. And I don't know where that stands. I talked to them maybe a year ago and I said, please put me on the list. I'd love to plant one of your trees. I'd love to get one. There was probably going to be a great clamor for those trees. But as I say, that process has gotten messed up. And I think that that shows, it was done, that was an effort that was done, um, you know, very rigorously and very with the best of intentions. I do believe that, but it shows you how difficult this is.
Hi everyone, this is Jack from the Court of Everything. This is usually the time where people put an advert into their episode, but we don't have one of those. So I guess we'll just carry on with the episode. And if you fancy it, maybe follow us on Instagram at Copod, COE Pod, or maybe even Twitter or X at the Copod, COE Pod. Let's carry on. At the moment, our 20th century extinction rates became hundreds of times larger than the background rate of extinction, which is the natural level of species go extinct per year. And that correlates with our growing technologies and railroads and the such. And one line in the book I found particularly interesting was one way to make sense of this biodiversity crisis would be simply to accept it. Uh, is that the sort of acceptance in terms of the perspective of that we've had mass extinction events before, and are we now we're another one? And how passive and how reactive are we?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the point I was just trying to make there is we could just own up to it and say, yes, we're an agent of mass extinction, and so be it. Now, honestly, that's how we're acting. That is how we are acting, whether we are acknowledging it or not, we are acting that way. But we are unwilling to just, say that. And I think that there are many reasons for that. The first one being, or the primary one being, that it's so terrifying. I mean, it's very I think everyone can appreciate that mass extinction is not something that you ultimately, control. It's not something that humans are going to escape from unscathed. I'm not necessarily saying that humans are going to go extinct in a mass extinction of our own making, but there will be a lot of consequences that are hard to anticipate and that will be extremely unpleasant.
course.
A and B, I don't think we want to take moral responsibility for uh, leaving the planet a greatly impoverished place.
Yes, I think that's true. I think there's a guilt behind it. To say that we're stewards of Earth it comes across almost arrogant sometimes because we're the ones that put it into this place in the first place. And sometimes I question, are we trying to reduce global warming to save sort of wildlife, or are we trying to save ourselves? And it might be cloaked under us saying, let's save the polar bears because they're helpless. But actually, what we're really saying is we're terrified that we'll kill ourselves as well.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, there was a time maybe maybe now you can't even say that. There was a time where you would say, well, climate change is at least getting a lot of attention and a lot of financial, trying to deal with climate change has a lot of, financial financing behind it. That has increasingly, even that's not true. Whereas the kinds of efforts that are clearly just aimed at biodiversity, preserving biodiversity, not preserving humanity, have a lot less energy and a lot less money behind them.
Mm, of course. Yeah. One thing that I like to pull up is the pupfish to get a
Yeah.
bit of a lighter note because they're very sweet animals. We've mentioned them before on the core of everything as well. And you talk about the Stockholm species, so which is the idea that our impact has created animals, another class of animals, ones that we've pushed to the edge of extinction and then yanked them back again. And the pupfish is one of them. Uh, I thought the story was lovely in terms of a way in which humans have sort of helped an animal in crisis.
Yeah, the Devil's Hole pupfish is a really amazing story, long running now, going back to the 70s basically. Um, they're called the rarest fish in the world. They live in this one very warm pool of water in the Mojave, and their numbers started to decline a long time ago when and how they got there and why they're there and how they survived. It's all kind of an extravagant mystery. But when people started pumping the groundwater out of the area in, I guess, the 60s, um, their numbers started to crash, and people were already watching this happen, and they've tried all sorts of things, just this sort of amazing litany of steps that people have taken to try to save them, and they exist, in always at this very on this very precarious in this very precarious place, which they always were. If you only have one habitat, you're obviously in a precarious situation. And one of the interesting things about their situation is under the Endangered Species Act, you can't have just one population in one place and consider that um, population to get off the list. They could basically never get off the endangered species list because they really only have this one natural habitat. So they're sort of in its perpetual state of endangerment. And even if you got their numbers up in their pool that they live in, that they are native to, they still wouldn't get off the endangered species list because, as they say, they only have this one habitat.
And I like how humans are, yeah, I do like how we are trying to save them in a sense of they've got that sort of a separate tank where they put some in and they provide, since 2006, the Park Service has been providing meals to them, which I thought was quite sweet. You called it a grub hub for fish.
Yeah, no, they
Mhm.
get supplemental food. They, as you say, they have a whole separate habitat that's designed to mimic this original pool as closely as possible, down to the contours of the walls of the pool. It's quite a fascinating place, and it's been a real struggle to get them to reproduce there, but they have had some success.
Of course. Yeah. Grubhub. Yeah, you say Grubhub. I think Scuba Eats was an opportunity there. It's a nice
Oh,
little
that's
joke.
good.
But
I
maybe,
like it. I like it.
yeah,
I
you
wish
could use
I'd
that in
thought
your
of
next
that.
book.
Yeah.
I did wrap my brain for that pun, to be honest. I had to like, there's something here. But moving on, we've gone from talking about pop fish and gene editing, but now we can look at some other examples in the book, amongst many. and one of those things which is sort of using natural mechanisms or mechanisms inspired by nature to our advantage. And one of those things is assisted evolution, which I thought was great. If evolution is survival of the fittest, can we speed up the evolution of animals to save them from extinction?
Yeah, so this is this idea that you know, these coral researchers came up with this idea of creating this super coral. It very quickly got dubbed that. And the idea was, can you cross a lot of different corals that wouldn't necessarily meet up in the wild? You'd bring them together. You would, they spawn coral. Most corals spawn only once a year. You sort of bring them together. I've been to this spawning. I've been to a natural spawning. I've been to this weird unnatural spawning. Anyway, it's a marvelous sight. And then you'd bring together these eggs and larvae of corals that wouldn't naturally come together. You would, what happens is coral form these little larvae, they swim around, they settle out of the water column, and then they start to form, what we know of as corals. And you will let them do that, and then you'll subject them to various levels of stress, heat stress in general, and you will see which ones do the best. And maybe you can find these hybrids basically that are more heat tolerant than the corals that are out there now. And I think it's a very interesting idea. Many people have pointed out the limitations of that, even if you were to create. I mean, there are many, many problems. First of all, you might be more heat tolerant, but you might be more, less resilient to other threats. So, you have to go through this a lot of elaborate testing. And then even if you do find something that's both heat tolerant and resilient to other threats, you have to think, well, how do you propagate that? Corals are the Great Barrier Reef, where this effort is sort of concentrated, focus is the size of Italy. That's a huge, area to try to sort of propagate. And when you look at coral farming sort of efforts in coral, restoration projects, they're usually tiny in scale. It's just very, very, it takes a long time for corals to grow. It's very, very hard to do them at any scale that would really meaningfully make a dent in all the damage that we're seeing from ocean warming, which is having this terrible effect on coral reefs.
Yeah, exactly. Um, yes, I think that the idea you also talk about is Darwin's paradox.
You only find coral reefs in these very resource poor
Yeah.
parts of the ocean where you don't have a lot of nutrients. So how do these fantastically, there's not a lot of upwelling, there's not a lot of, yeah, they're, it's why when you go to the Caribbean or someplace like that, the water is very, very clear. There's just not a lot of nutrients in it. And so not much can live. And yet you get reefs that are in some places, you get reefs that are just fantastically
Mm.
rich and biodiverse. And how is that possible? That's the paradox.
Yes, and I think one of the solutions is that it's so symbiotic. One coral's trash is another one's treasure. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. That's sort of the theory. Now, you can ask a lot of evolutionary questions about that. How did that evolve? And that's beyond my pay grade, as it were. But yes, that's sort of seems to be how that happens, how that functions now, now that coral reefs have in fact evolved.
Yes. The second example from the book that I'd like to talk about is why actually is the book is called Under a White Sky, and that's to do with solar radiation engineering, where we're producing artificial volcanoes to drop global temperatures.
Yeah, so that sort of was the ultimate example of this, pattern that I'm trying to get at in the book of, an intervention that begets another intervention. And this is it would be truly a global intervention. It would be to spray reflective particles in the stratosphere where they would drift around for a year or two. And then before falling out of the stratosphere, you'd have to replenish them all the time. And that would reflect sunlight back to space. It would have a cooling effect and it would counteract dumping a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere, which has a warming effect. And you can do it. You could counteract some of the warming, you could counteract all of the warming. I don't think anyone would recommend counteracting all of the warming. That would mean blocking a good bit of sunlight at this point. But you could potentially, people talk about, cutting the top off the curve. You could potentially um, reduce that maximum temperature that we're going to get to.
Yeah, one thing yes, my concern sometimes with that is sulfur aerosols. The fact they reflect sunlight, it caused a massive drop in temperature at the end of the Triassic era, 200 million years ago, that caused 76% of life to die. Um, and it's problematic if we never know quite how nature's going to react, and if we start meddling when dropping global temperatures by putting sulfur aerosols, or the other example is maybe diamonds into the atmosphere, we never know how it's going to turn out.
Yeah, it's not something I would recommend. I don't think uh, I don't think most scientists would recommend it. I think it's a sign of desperation that we're even talking about it. And I think, what's scary about it is that we seem to live, I think it becomes scarier by the day, to be honest. We seem to live in a moment where people are willing to try stuff, without really knowing what the repercussions are, and where this sense that, technology is going to save us has become our sort of default, um, you know, uh, mode of operating, and I just don't. And that leads you to geoengineering. Well, okay, we're sort of clearly not reducing our carbon emissions. That does not seem to be happening. So what are we going to do? Well, okay, well, we'll geoengineer our way out. Now, um, it would be nicer to think, that would work. I mean, I think it, might well work to lower global temperatures, but as you say, at what cost? What are the knock-on, effects of that? And one of them that's pretty well established is, just changing regional weather patterns. It's not like you can counteract warming with cooling and get back to the same climate. You're getting to a new, weird
Yeah.
climate, and no one knows exactly what that's going to be. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and there's a lot of geopolitical uncertainty, and um, it's also hard to imagine, on the one hand, where you say, well, that's the thing we have in our back pocket. That's sort of the ace in the hole when everything starts to go south. Um, but it's hard to imagine geopolitically how it could be accomplished. We're a world we can't agree on anything. We can agree on less and less. And this would be something with, true global ramifications. And any country that was dismayed by what was going on, that had a powerful air force, could potentially disrupt it.
Hmm. Yes, and obviously, yes, as you say, weather patterns, and then there's knock-on effects with solar panels as well, because if we're blocking out the sun, that's not so good for solar energy and crops. So
Yeah.
I think the Tambora eruption a few decades ago meant that big hit on agriculture.
Pinatubo, you mean? Yeah.
Pinatubo, you're quite right.
Yeah. I don't know if Pinatubo had a big hit on agriculture. Certainly Tambora, which was actually, in the 19th century, sort of 1815 or so, that was a huge eruption in Indonesia, and that had a huge effect on agriculture. It caused a great deal of starvation, and it was called the year without a summer.
Yeah.
And that's very well documented in a very fascinating time in history.
Yeah, and actually one of our guests we've had on before talks about the year that summer in the fact that it's around is the Battle of Waterloo, I believe, around that time. And
Exactly,
he
exactly.
thinks that, well, it was a nice story, but there's a lot of reason why Napoleon lost the Battle of Waterloo. He thinks that the volcano disrupted weather patterns so badly that it led to the downpour in the Battle of Waterloo, meant it was so muddy. It was one of the reasons why the French troops lost. Um, but it's an interesting theory.
It
Interesting
is an
theory nonetheless.
interesting theory. It's certainly a reason why, there was a lot of unrest, and I think in Europe at the time, and I think that the fact that people were starving, clearly had something to do with that. They're quite well documented sort of, bread riots. I mean, people really had nothing to eat.
Wow. Yeah. To finish, I don't mind, but we can't really talk about climate change at the moment without bringing up the current change in the political climate
Yeah.
briefly. And You wrote scientists can only make recommendations, but implementation is a political decision, and that's on the last page of your book. You wrote this during the first Trump term, and now we're chatting at the start of the second. And currently, there's a lot of funding cuts from the Trump administration for climate science, and some of my colleagues are very worried about their jobs, and some people have lost their jobs. But your new book is called H is for Hope. Yes, there are deep uncertainties of the future, but where does optimism lie, if there is some?
Well, I want to say that H's for Hope was written during the Biden administration, when there might have been some reason for hope. And the book is definitely, somewhat agnostic about that, despite the title, hope is one possibility. And there were certainly things that the Biden administration did that um, made people hopeful, and rightly so. The Inflation Reduction Act was a serious effort to try to move the country forward on clean energy. Now that is being unraveled, and it's very hard, as you suggest, as people are having to take climate, the word climate, out of their climate science grants. It's very hard to find reasons for optimism right now. It's the only sort of thing that you can point to is the fact that in over the last couple of decades, the cost of what used to be called alternative forms of energy, but probably shouldn't anymore, they've come way down. And so, in a logical world, we would be pursuing a lot of clean energy simply for economic reasons. And maybe we will continue to simply for economic reasons. But certainly, all indications from the Trump administration are they're going to make that very difficult,
Hmm.
because a lot of clean energy projects, even if they're economically viable, they require permits, federal permits.
Yeah.
And those are, so they're really, you could argue, very actively trying to intervene in what should be a growing industry, what is a growing industry. And that, the question, there are different estimates about how much, damage they can and will do. But it's very hard uh, to be optimistic right now, to be hopeful right now. I think if anyone has reasons why I should be, I'd like them to please reach out.
Yeah. I think one way to maybe is the climate burden doesn't just lie with the US. There's been amazing research in Europe, for example, and now it's not just time that for collaboration to produce innovative climate research, but also to look after the scientists themselves. Uh, I'm not really
Yes,
providing a
and I
solution.
Yes, and people also point to the fact that, the Americans are, going to hand these industries of the future over to the Chinese, who are making great strides. And that may be bad for our national interest, but maybe good for internet, maybe good for the world. And, so be it. If that's true, if the Chinese are going to sell the rest of the world, cheap solar panels, the Americans just screwed up, and that's our problem. What worries me is that, if a country like the US doesn't make a transition to electric cars, and much of the rest of the world doesn't, and we're seeing every day, there's just a story today about the Brazilians leasing tracts in the Amazon for oil. I mean, uh, once you put in a lot more fossil fuel infrastructure, the political pressure to keep that infrastructure going until it can get paid off 30, 40, 50 years from now is very high. And that's this phenomenon, lock in. And that's what I'm afraid, we're going to see a lot of over the next 4 years.
Yeah. Well, one hopes the solution lay in the collective, not just the individual. But your new book is H is for Hope, where you investigate climate change from A to Z, and you reference all things from flying electric planes to Greta Thunberg's blah 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 speech. Um, it's out now. I'd say it's a must read. And Elizabeth Kolbert, thank you so much for coming on Core of Everything. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. Thanks a lot.
Appreciate it. Thank you.